After wishing everyone a Chodesh Tov, we will very quickly complete our discussion of the Lechem Aponim and begin our discussion of Minchas Nesachim. Now, to conclude our discussion of Lechem Aponim, I want to show you a little bit of a picture. I don't know if you can see it on Zoom. We'll give it a shot. And this is what the Lechem Aponim looks like. You see that little diagram? Very strange lechem. You know, I've eaten lechem in many different countries, but I never saw anything just like this. Now, what you'll notice about this diagram is that the Lechem Aponim has these chronos. Remember, we spoke about those corners. And what's called Lechem Aponim here is because it's very interesting. According to apparently one Mandiomar at the end of Masechta Menachos, that's Rabbi Chanina, the Lechem Aponim is actually open like a box on two sides. Again, if you see in the picture, it's got an opening on both sides. It's only closed on the other two sides. And Rabbi Yochanan apparently disagrees with Rabbi Chanina, and he says that it's not missing these two sides. And Belinetta, what we want to talk about in the Masechta Yoma, not in the Hakdama to Kodshim, is, you know, what were the Alexandrian experts that were imported from Egypt? What was their confusion? And why was it so complicated for them to create and bake the Lechem Aponim? So Belinetta will talk about that a little bit. Behemshech Hadvar. Nifras echad me'alecham. Imagine there are 12 loaves of bread that are sitting on the shulchan, and they were placed on the shulchan last Shabbos, and the piruk, they will be removed this Shabbos, a full week later. Somewhere in between, 1 out of 12 of the lechamim was broken, and that's called nifras echad min halechamim. So that there's one critical moment, which we're going to have to try to identify in the second Shabbos, when even if the lechamim are still sitting on the shulchan, their period of time has already come to fruition, and now the lechem is fine. Then we go ahead and we eat the lechem and we break it into pieces. That's after one critical moment. But until that critical moment, which is in the second Shabbos, we must have the lechem on the shulchan, sholem, and all 12 of them. Is therefore, if nifras echad, kodem she'igia zman piruk hamareches. Again, we don't know exactly how to identify. That's going to be our next discussion. The zman piruk, when has the Lechem Aponim reached its fruition, and now we're ready to take it off and replace it with the new Lechem. Whenever that moment is, if before that moment the Lechem, one Lechem was broken, then it has the same din, listen carefully, as Nechsera HaMincha Kodem Kmitza, which means the following. Every Mincha has Kmitza, and then Shirayim. What happens after Kmitza is irrelevant. The Mincha is Kshera, as long as we reach that one critical moment of Kmitza. But if before the Kmitza, part of the solace, the flour that makes up this mincha was removed. That's called chaser. So it's not complete. So you've taken away some of the kmitza. Then the mincha is psula. And now we have a case not of chisaron mincha b'kmitza, but chisaron lechem aponim kodem zman piruka. Up until the critical moment of piruk, we're dealing with kodem kmitza in this analogy. B'nifsalu halechamim kula. This is what we call, in Yiddish, we call it adagar, adagarnished. Or in modern Hebrew, they say, O hakol, o lo klum. If you don't have all 12 lechamim in their proper shlemus before the Zman HaPiruk, if one of those lechamim is missing, it's chaser, it's like chaser b'kmitza, and all 12 lechamim are disqualified. Now, keep in mind, as we've mentioned more than once, the lechem haponim is part of a broader process, which includes what's called the shtei bazichen, otherwise known as haktaras halevona. And in the symbiotic relationship, so to speak, between the levona and the shtei alechem, the levona is going to be matir the shtei alechem. I'm sorry, I keep saying shtei alechem. What I mean is lechem aponim. The levona, the bazichen, is meant to be matir the lechem aponim. But guess what? In this circumstance, nifrasa echad me'alechamim, there's no way that the bazichen could be matir the lechamim because they're already disqualified. In such a case, we will not be matir the levona. So remember, yesterday we discussed there were two vertical set of shelves on the shulchan that were 6 on the left, 6 on the right, and each marocha had its own one of the bazichen, a bezek, with a spoonful of levona. Now that one out of the 12 was nifrisa, and how much more so if it was totally lost, what we need to do now is freeze the process of haktaras halevona, because if the haktaras halevona has no possibility of being matir the lechem aponim, then there's no haktaras halevona. So the haktaras halevona is meaningful in the context of the lechem aponim. Now, what I presented to you now is the sheet of Rashi. Tosfos disagrees with Rashi. Now, if you would ask me, again, we're not learning Menachos inside, but if you'd ask me why Tosfos rejects Rashi, I would tell you intuitively, the answer to this is that for 40 years in the Midbar, they brought the kivsei atzeres without the shtei alechem, and perhaps there was haktaras halevona without the lechem aponim. But my premise is that just like in shtei alechem and Chag HaShavuos, you required min haaretz, be moshel secher, that same requirement applies to the lechem aponim. That remains to be proven. But if I can prove that to you, then my conclusion would be, according to Tosfos, that the levona, since it could be brought during the period of time of the midbar, even in the absence of the lechem aponim, it means that the levona could exist independent of the lechem aponim. But what I'm telling you now, I think, is absolutely incorrect, to be honest. Because in the case of kivsei atzeres, that is a korban unto itself, and it also has an impact on the shtei alechem, to be matir the shtei alechem. But nevertheless, the kivsei atzeres are a shalmei tzibur, kodshim, unto themselves. Not so in the case of the levona. The levona and the haktaras halevona is purely 100% from A to Z, an accompaniment of the lechem hapanim. When we set up the lechem hapanim and the shulchan, we add the two bazichin on the two sides of the maracha to accompany the lechem hapanim. But I would not say that the Haftarah of the Levona is a carbon unto itself, like the Shnei Kimsei Atzeres of Chag HaShavuos. The Haftarah of the Bazichin begins and ends; it exhausts itself with the Lechem Hapanim. In the absence of the Lechem Hapanim, there is no room for Haftarahs HaBazichin, Haftarahs HaLevona. Yesh min harishonim shekasar shemekar psul zeh u'mima shenever b'lechem hapanim kodesh kodshim hu. And the word hu is in Lashon Yachid, and it's referring to 12 different chalos. Rashi says that the 12 different chalos are not each an independent entity of itself, but rather 12 chalos integrate to form an entity called the Lechem Hapanim, and therefore it's either 12 or bust. If one of the 12 was Nifrasa, that's it. There is no Lechem Hapanim. And all this is derived from the word hu, Kodesh Kodshim hu. If we were to separate each one of the Lechamim as a separate entity, it should have said Kodesh Kodshim Haim. Now, everything that we've discussed until now about Nifrasa applies before that critical moment when, as we said at the outset, the Lechem Hapanim reaches its fruition, which is called Zman or Shas HaPiruk. That's when we're going to remove the Lechem Hapanim in the second Shabbos off the Shulchan to replace Nifrat li'achar shehigia Zman Piruko. So I'm going to look at my watch, and on Shabbos, I'm going to say, wait a minute, it's already Zman Piruko, but it's Nifras. But the Prisa took place after that moment of Zman Piruko. Is that's equal to a case of, in other menachos, where you already did the Kmitza, you haven't yet done the Haftarah, which is the clincher, when you take the balance of the solas of the mincha, and you are makir on the mizbeh. I'm sorry. And you take the balance of the mincha and you give it to the zikrei kuhuna to eat. But the critical moment, the matir, the achila of the mincha, is the kometz, and you've already passed that moment. You already did the kmitza, so the kmitza is gone. It's history. And then afterwards, some psul occurs subsequent to the kmitza. In such a case of nifrasoli achar shigia zman piruko maktirin olav es habazich. Wow. Here's the punchline. Aval hu atzmo nifsal me'achil. We finally got to the point, after all our discussions, where we split between the law of the Bazichin and the law of the Lechem Hapanim. Till now, we've assumed they're intertwined. We call it Yiddish gebunden, if you know what I mean. Right? It's one entity. Here's a case where we could go ahead and be maktir the Bazichin without allowing achila of the Lechem Hapanim. Meaning, we've always assumed that either you cannot be maktir the Lechem and therefore the Bazichin is meaningless, or the Bazichin is meaningful because it's coming to be maktir the Lechem. Here's a case where the Bazichin could not be maktir the Lechem, and yet we'll be maktir the Bazichin. Why? Because the nifrasa took place after Higia Zman Hapiruk. That critical moment has passed. The moment that parallels Kmitza and other menachos. And that moment, once it passes, locks in the Aktaras HaBazichin in such a way that what happens to the lechem afterwards is irrelevant. So basically what it means is at that moment in time, the bazichin are matir the lechem. If something happens afterwards to the lechem, it could passel the lechem, but it has no impact on the bazichin. Fascinating. Now, when is this magical moment of Higia Zman HaPiruk? You know, we can go out and celebrate. Higia Zman HaPiruk. So here we have a Shitas Rashi and a Shitas Aram. Rashi, at the very beginning of Menachos, says that Zman HaPiruk u'b'shah sheva shel Yom HaShabbos. Okay, what does that mean? Shah Sheva. Shah Sheva basically means noon. On Shabbos noon, it's called Higia Zman HaPiruk, and there's a simple reason why. Because at that moment we are obligated in Hanoch, in placing the new series of Lechem HaParim onto the Shulchan. So it could be that the process of replacing the Lechamim has been delayed for whatever reason. But once that moment passes, and you could replace the original Lechamim and be Makayim the mitzvah of Hanocha, what we call Sidur HaMarach, vis-a-vis the replacement, then it means it's the Shas Piruk, as far as last week's Lechem HaParim, because as we discussed at great length, it's Siluko Kisiduro, or shall we say Siduro Kisiluko? Well, let's just think which way is better. Siluko Kisiduro. We're going to take it off and we're going to replace it. And when do we take it off? When we're ready to replace it. The moment, the critical moment that's Machayev, that generates the chiyuv of Siduro, is the beginning of the new, the afternoon, meaning the turning point between the end of the 6th hour and the beginning of the 7th. And now we get to the Rambam Shita. The Rambam Shita is that with daybreak on Shabbos, the second Shabbos, that is called Zman Piruk. And therefore, the machlokas between Rashi and Rashi and the Rambam is going to be what happens if daybreak is at 6 a.m., noon is at 12 p.m., sometime during that 6-hour period of morning, it was nifras. According to Rashi, throw it all out. It's all the lechamim apostle. We're not going to be maktir the bazichin. It's an abort. And according to the Rambam, it's already higia shas hapiruk with daybreak. What is this machlokas about? So here in the Masifta there's a footnote, number Pei Dal. He says, Yesh Chidush Shel Hagriz, right? That was my Rebbe's uncle, the Brisker Rav. And he says the following. The Bira Machlokas. Nechlagu begeder psul lechem shenifras. L'shitas Rashi psulo hu mishum mincha shenechsera kodem kmitza. Yalkein nishach psul ze ad sheva shosh uzman hasiluk before. When do they actually remove the lechem hapanim of last week? That's at Shah Sheva. The achar mikan nechshav kimincha shekvar nikmitza. Aval shitas haRambam hapsul b'chisaron b'lechem. In the case of nifras, eino mishum mincha shenechsera kodem kmitza, ela hu psul mechudash b'fnei atzmo b'lechem hapanim. Shekol od yesh bo din sidur ve'hanocha al gabi hashulchan yesh bo shem lechem hapanim shechisrono ma'akiv. And ma'akiv means both in terms of the lechem and in terms of the aktoras habazich. Aval li'achar she'igia zman oli parik now hashulchan shuv ein bo din lechem haponim the ein chisrono mi'akiv aktoras habazich.
What is there?
It says that there are two ways of defining the psul of nifras in lechem haponim. One way is to say that it's a psul in the process, in the avodah. And it's similar to a case of a psul of chisaron in kmitza. And we have to wait now until the actual kmitza to establish that there will no longer be a psul in the shirayim. And sorry?
Hi, Rabbi, how are you? Sandy Herskowitz.
How are you doing, Sandy? I don't see you, but I hear your voice.
My video is not working right now for some reason, but I'm listening. Is the Monei HaMitzvahs, when it comes to Lechem HaPanim, is there separate mitzvahs involved? In other words, is there a mitzvah of Hanacha Baziche of Levona and a mitzvah of Hanachas Halechem Hapanim and a separate one of Siluk or Achila, or is it all one mitzvah?
It's one mitzvah, but it's two kiyumin, meaning there's one kiyum of Siluk and another kiyum of Hanoch, of and what we call Siduron and Silukum. But it's all one mitzvah of Lechem Hapanim. I thought you were going to ask me a different question, the answer which I don't know, whether or not Shtei Bazichin is a separate mitzvah.
That's what I said. Is Levona a separate mitzvah as well?
Oh, that I don't know. I would have to research that. But I thought what I thought you were asking was whether or not removing last week's and putting down the replacement of this week's is two separate.
Yeah, no,
that's one mitzvah. You know, that's
okay, because I'm not sure how the Rambam lists is. I mean, in the Psukim, it seems that Levona comes, a little bit after the Inyanim of the Lechem Hapanim. Mashma that might be something independent.
Yeah, if you ask me intuitively, my guess would be that the Levona is a separate mitzvah Taryag. I don't know, okay. But again, I just want to for my own sake, just to knock in this Brisker Rav. Again, we're talking about any time between 6 a.m. on the second Shabbos and 12 noon, it became nifras. Rashi would say, in such a case, it's possible. We have to wait till noon in order to lock it in, as we said, as a situation of higia zman piruk. The Rambam says no. With daybreak, it's already considered higia zman piruk, and the lechem, even if it's nifras, has no impact, and it's not possible. Says the Brisker Rav, it all depends. There's what you call befall, and there's what you call theory, conceptual, meaning, are we talking about the moment in which they actually take off, which we call siluk, the lechem hapanim, or are we talking about the theoretical possibility of taking it off? And herein lies the difference between Shosh Shvius and Boker and Shachar. They actually took off the lechem aponim and replaced it with the second group, the new group for this new week, at Shosh Shvius. That's when they actually did it. They would not remove the lechem aponim from last week until they replaced it with this week, as we discussed at great length yesterday, because there's a lot of tamid with regard to the shulchan, that we want to make sure that the shulchan is always occupied and carrying the lechem aponim. So if you ask me, when did they actually take off the lechem aponim from the shulchan? When was the Zman Piruk before? In actuality, it was at 12 noon. And that hence is Rashi's Shita. Why? Because Rashi understood that this psul of Nifras should be viewed and classified in a universal perspective. It's just simply an application of what we know universally. And that is like in any mincha, if the mincha became possible, you have to ask yourself, was it before the kmitza or after the kmitza? That depends upon when the Kohen actually did the kmitza. And if you parallel and apply the same logic to lechem aponim, when did they actually remove the lechem of last week from the shulchan? They waited until they were ready for the new hanacha of Sidur HaMaracha of this new week's lechem haponim, which would only take place at Shosh. The Rambam, on the other hand, says that the psul of Nifras is unique and it is indigent to the laws of lechem aponim. This is not a universal halacha. If it was a universal halacha, we'd have to wait till the 7th hour. No, this halacha in lechem aponim. In the law of lechem aponim, the siluk of lechem aponim, this man piruk, is daybreak. We may be, how should I say, practically speaking, we may be forced or compelled to delay the actual piruk until Sheva, but in terms of the law of the lechem, once it reaches the morning of the Shabbos, is ready for piruk. And if he would be mafarikid, at that time he would be yotze. They would not do so because they waited to make sure that the shulchan would not be empty until they finally replaced it with the new lechem aponim. But as far as last week's lechem aponim, the halacha of piruk is chal with daybreak. The actual piruk took place 6 hours later at noon. Okay, that's just getting the tip of the iceberg here of this analysis of the Brisker Rule. So let's just take 5 minutes, Rabosai, to introduce our new topic, which Belinetta will be studying for quite a while. And that is what we call Nisachin. Every mincha is accompanied by Nisachin. Now, when we talk about Nisachin, we're basically describing yayin. When the yayin is in accompanying of a mincha, and that mincha is what's called a minchas nisachim, a mincha, right? Let's say, for example, in a carbon ola or in a carbon shlamim, we have to bring an accompanying mincha. Now, in addition to the mincha, which is made of soles, we need to accompany the ola or the shlamim with yayin l'nesachim. Now, in Talmudic terminology, if you looked up in a book of Talmudic terminology, the word nesachim is used for yayin. Minchas nesachim is used to relate to the mincha itself, meaning the solas. But if you see the word nesachim anywhere in the Mishnah and the Gemara, in Masechta Menachos, then it's referring to the yayin. And that's called, let me read it to you inside. He says, Hasoles yachanim yayin. When you have to accompany the mincha with yayin, that's called nisach. Okay, so that's just a rule, that we should use. Like the Rambam opens up Hilchot Shabbos and he says, whenever you see the word chayav in Hilchot Shabbos, it means that you're chayav skila, b'mezid, and karma chatas b'shogeg. If you see the word aser, it means it's aser midivrei sofer. Sometimes when you learn a new sugya, you have to give the terminology. So the terminology here for us is nisach. All karbanos behemoth shall olav shall shlam. And now we're not differentiating between a carbon of a yachid or a carbon of a tzibur. If it's classified as either an ola or a shlamim, then it requires nisach. Now, exactly how much and what is the exact measurement and the volume of nisachim, that's what we're going to discuss. And it's very interesting because the ola, the shlam, the carbon itself, the zevach, will determine how much yayin must accompany the mincha, to create nisachim. Now, every rule has to have an exception. So there are two exceptions to the rule that we just formulated. One is the mitzorah. And for the little that I know of Kodshim, you gentlemen may be experts in Kodshim, but the little that I know in Kodshim, some of the most complicated issues in Kodshim revolve around the mitzorah. Mitzorah has to be three different carbons, and he needs luk shemen, and he needs matan bohanos, and the whole, to purify the mitzorah, you have to learn all about the mitzorah. But in one sense, with regard to menachos, the carbon of the mitzorah is very unique in the constellation of Nisach. And that's what he writes here, that there are no Nisachim in a case of a carbon chatos. There are no Nisachim in the case of a carbon acham, only in Minchat Shlam, only in Olad Shlam, with the exception of the three karbanos of the Nazir, two of which are chatos and asham, both requiring nisach. So if you wake up a Talmud Chacham in the middle of the night and ask him the question, when is there nisachim for either a chatos and an asham, make sure he utters the word mitzorah. And in that sense, mitzorah breaks all the rules. And we could have a chatos with nisachim, and we can have an asham with nisachim. Forget about the shlamim. The shlam always needs nisachim. Now we have exception number two, but in the opposite direction. A carbon which is fundamentally, and I use that word in brackets, in inverted commas, the British say, it's shlamim, and yet there are no nisachim. And that's going to be Bechar, Maser, and Pesach. These are three karbanos which are shlamim, but shall I say almost shlamim. They're not exactly shlamim. And in many ways, Bechar, Maser, and Pesach are dissimilar to shlamim. And for that, we have to learn about those three categories of karbanos. And one of the ways that these three karbanos deviate from shlamim is with regard to nisachim. All shlamim require the accompaniment of nisachim, with the exceptions of Bechar, Meiser, and Pesach. And we've just basically summarized a Mishnah in Menachos that is 90 blot into the Masechta. Does that mean that we know Masechta Menachos? We don't know beans about Menachos, but we're giving an overview. And I'm hoping that in Mitzvah Hashem, when we learn Menachos, we'll have at least some orientation, and some of the things that we learn here will be somehow embedded in our memory. Maybe not up front, but at least in the back of our memory. So it'll be a little bit easy. So this is where we're going to stop for today. Let's just make a note. And in Mitzvah Hashem, we'll continue tomorrow.